UK is reaching epidemic levels, and it's costing us billions of pounds every year. Deliberate crashes, bogus personal injury claims, even phantom pets. The fraudsters are risking more and more to make a quick killing. And every year, it's adding up to £50 to your insurance bill. Insurers are fighting back, armed with covert surveillance systems.
The subject out the vehicle.
Sophisticated data analysis techniques. And highly skilled dedicated police units.
Stay where you are!
They're catching the criminals red-handed. All those con men, scammers and cheats on the fiddle, now they're caught in the act. And claim and shame. Today, a country pub goes up in smoke and things get heated for a pair of fire-starting fraudsters.
It showed Dean and Melinda looking for the bag that we had recovered, and a most unusual response to that, almost hysterical.
The Specialist Police Unit IFED shuts down a gang of motor insurance fraudsters.
I don't think they expected to get caught so quickly, but ultimately most fraudsters will get caught.
And the conman's elaborate Stag cover story starts to unravel.
Despite travelling to Edinburgh for a stag weekend, there was no luggage whatsoever in the minibus.
In July 2011, a huge fire broke out at the Toll House pub in Lymington in New Forest. The flames spread rapidly, cutting off people trapped on the upper floor. The emergency services were called to what had quickly become a life or death situation. Justin Norris is from Hampshire Police.
The fire was in the early hours of the morning, and we attended the scene within 5 minutes of the call from Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service.
With the fire threatening to rage out of control, the first priority was to get everyone out safely. Duncan White is a crew manager with Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service who attended the scene.
It was a very severe fire. You could see why the people were trapped in the upstairs rooms. The fire in the stairwell was the reason why the people were trapped at the first floor, because it compromised their means of escape.
At great risk to their own safety, the fire officers entered the building and managed to get everyone out, undoubtedly saving their lives. According to the emergency call from Dean and Melinda Thomas, who owned the pub, the devastating blaze was the result of foul play.
They suspected a burglary, or somebody who tried to break into their premises. We started to treat it as a scene of a crime.
The fire was so intense, it was a miracle that no one had been seriously hurt.
The whole pub was completely 100% smoke damaged.
With the blaze finally out, the police began their investigation by talking to the owners about the events of that night, in particular the suspected burglary.
Dean had been awoken, had come downstairs, having heard a noise of smashing glass, looked around the premises, didn't find anything to start with, went back upstairs. Within half an hour, the fire alarms had gone off. He then alerted the rest of the people in the house, and he discovered a fire downstairs.
Dean Thomas believed that the burglar was after the pub's takings.
He reported that some money had been stolen from downstairs, and that they tried to cover their tracks by causing this fire.
However, there was a fundamental problem with his version of events.
It's highly unusual for a burglar to break into a premise and to set fire to it without any other motive or reason to do so.
Dean's story simply didn't ring true, and suspicions were immediately aroused. The police examined the scene of the fire for further evidence, starting with the smashed window, which, according to Dean, was the burglar's entry point.
You couldn't have possibly got into the premises without disturbing the glass fragments on this windowsill. They weren't disturbed at all.
Their next discovery threw even more doubt on Dean's story.
We found a petrol can that was recovered from in an outhouse that had been concealed behind some items, behind a case, which was unusual as well.
This tied in with evidence from the fire officers who'd fought the blaze.
In a normal domestic fire, it's a grey smoke, but this was a very black smoke.
The colour of the smoke and the discovery of the hidden petrol can seemed to indicate that the fire had been fuelled by an accelerant such as petrol. Dean's story was unravelling fast, and the police looked into the couple's finances as a possible motivation for arson.
It became really apparent quite quickly that Thomases were in significant debt.
Evidence was mounting on all sides that the fire had been deliberately started by the Thomases for an insurance payout, but conclusive proof was lacking until a chance discovery in the grounds of the property.
We recover a bag of clothing. We don't know whose clothing this is, but we discover it's outer clothing, sort of tracksuit bottoms and a top, and some domestic gloves. We didn't know why it was there, we didn't know whose it was, but we suspected it was something to do with the fire.
Sensing a chance to catch the culprits red-handed, the police set up surveillance of the area with a hidden camera.
We thought that whoever put the bag there might come back to the scene to try and recover it, to dispose of it, because we believed at the time this was the bag of clothing that had been used to start the fire.
Unlike Fraudsters, the camera never lies, and the surveillance footage meant that Dean Thomas's story went up in smoke.
It showed Dean and Melinda looking for the bag that we had recovered, and a most unusual response to that. Almost hysterical. It looks like they're arguing about it, and Melinda is throwing her arms around a little bit as well.
Melinda was confronted by the police, and even then the lies continued.
She said in an interview to us that the reason why she reacted that way was because she believed police officers had disturbed the grave of her dog.
But she convinced no one, and it was obvious that her hysterical response was because she knew they'd been found out. The fire had been started deliberately, and they hadn't done a very good job of covering their tracks.
It was quite clear that the motive was financial. They had wanted to get out of the contract with the brewery, whose premise as it was, and already done that, already asked to do that prior to the fire taking place.
The case eventually reached court, but despite the weight of evidence against them, unbelievably, the couple maintained their innocence.
During the trial, they pleaded not guilty, and it was a jury that convicted them. Dean Thomas was sentenced to 6 years in prison, and Melinda Thomas was sentenced to 3 years in prison.
Not only had they been driven by greed, but worse, they'd endangered the lives of the people in the pub and the firefighters who put out the fire. The heavy sentences reflected the seriousness of their crime.
Unfortunately for them, unfortunately for everyone else, the truth came out and we found out what happened in the end.
A fraud gang is scuppered after making an outrageous claim.
To put a claim in on a vehicle that they were driving and or involved with that did not have damage consistent to what's been portrayed is rather foolish.
And its insurance company in one corner, fake Olympic boxer in the other.
It's not untypical of insurance fraudsters to have aliases. I guess what's surprising in this case is that he sought to bring such attention to himself.
Combating the ever-increasing threat of insurance fraud is an elite police squad known as IFED, the Insurance Fraud Enforcement Department.
IFED is a 35-strong unit that works tirelessly to hunt down and prosecute insurance fraudsters wherever they may be throughout England and Wales.
From now on, fraudsters need to watch their back.
In only 18 months, we've arrested over 300 people. We will start to see a reduction in the insurance fraud in this country, which is ultimately what we're aiming for. It's highly likely now, if you commit any insurance fraud, you will get caught.
In 2012, IFED travelled to Torquay to carry out a raid on a gang of fraudsters believed to be behind various multi-vehicle accidents. The collisions were staged in order to cash in on motor insurance policies. It all started with a seemingly innocuous accident in 2009. Mike Brown from Direct Line was on the case.
The accident in 2009 involved 3 vehicles. One was driven by Mr Baker, a second vehicle driven by Mr Cash, and a third vehicle driven by Miss Shears. Mr Baker lost control of his vehicle and collided with the 2 vehicles driven by Miss Shears and Mr Cash.
At that stage, there was nothing to suggest fraud.
No suspicious circumstances surrounding that claim. It entered the claims process and the claims were eventually settled for all 3 vehicles.
DC Kate Sibley from IFED also worked on the case.
Claims were going in for personal injury, damage to cars, damage to property within the cars, loss of earnings, hire vehicles, whatever basically they could put a claim in for, they were putting a claim in.
In total, all 3 claims were settled for approximately £15,000.
And there the matter would have rested, had it not been for another accident 2 years later. Striking similarities to the claim from 2009 led to an investigation being launched.
Mr Baker appeared to be the offending driver on both occasions. There was 3 vehicles again involved. All parties knew each other, raised concerns.
All those involved in the accidents were linked and alarm bells started to ring. The cars from the second accident were then examined by an expert employed by the insurers.
The crash investigator basically said how they're saying the accident happened didn't match up with the damage to the vehicles. So in his opinion, it was unlikely that it actually took place.
To put a claim in on a vehicle that they were driving and or involved with that did not have damage consistent to what's being portrayed is rather foolish.
They'd made a big mistake, and this alerted the insurers to other aspects of the claim which raised suspicions, not least the huge amount of money involved.
In total, £80,000 was the amount of claims that would have been paid if we had not have intervened.
That intervention came in the form of an early morning IFED raid. The team started with a visit to Jonathan Baker, the man who'd driven into the back of the other vehicles in both the accidents. It was 6:30 in the morning when the IFED team arrived at the address. The father of the suspect came out to meet them and wanted to know what was going on.
I'm from the City of London Police. It's my ID, sir. We're looking for Mr. Jonathan Baker.
What's it for?
We want to speak to him in connection to an insurance fraud that we believe he's involved in. That's all the detail I can give you, sir.
Right.
Okay. I can speak to him more about it, but I can't yourself. I take it you are, sorry, you're his father?
I'm father, yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
he is.
He's in bed and he doesn't need to be disturbed.
Well, we need to speak to him, sir.
He revealed that his son was in, and Baker eventually came to talk to IFED.
I understand you're off work at the moment.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, we need to speak to you today. Okay. We need to take you to the local to Torquay and interview you in relation to a matter that's been referred to us.
Right.
In relation to what we suspect is an insurance fraud dating back to January of last year.
Right, okay.
Okay. That's it, basically.
Yeah, Jonathan Baker, you're under arrest, 7 o'clock, okay? You have standing man, bench for not mentioning one question. Subject to in court, and if you can do so, man, give any evidence, okay?
He was taken down to the local police station for further questioning.
All right, mate, just take your seat in there behind the passenger seat, please.
While the IFED team was travelling to their next raid location, they got some good news from the station.
He's just been booked in and just been put in a cell. He just came out with it, indicated that he knew what it was all about, and said that he didn't see any point in lying about any involvement. So I don't know what he's going to say on the interview. We obviously didn't question him any further, but he asked if we were picking up any of the others that were involved, was his exact words. So what exactly that means, I don't know.
It was the breakthrough the case needed. Although the raid had started well, there were still 2 crucial arrests to make, and the team had to stay focused. When they arrived at the next address, they immediately knew they were at the right place, because parked outside was a vehicle that was central to the case.
Oh, his car's there. That Mazda is pretty much what it's all about.
There's a bright green Mazda RX-7, which had been modified at the garage. It won numerous awards for the modifications to it and was on the front of several magazines.
The car belonged to Carter Oram, the man involved in the second crash. IFED believed that this had been deliberately staged to fund expensive modification work on his Mazda. Despite the presence of his car, the suspect believed to be at the second location wasn't Carter Oram. It was a man thought to have allowed his details to be used for one of the fraudulent insurance claims. The team secured the exits and prepared to enter through the main door.
We're in.
After they'd identified themselves, the suspect cooperated by letting them in.
Firstly, okay, I need to speak to you today regarding an allegation that's been made where it's alleged that you're involved in a conspiracy to defraud insurance companies. Right? Hear me out, yeah? Okay, so in relation to that offence and that allegation, I'm arresting you on suspicion of conspiracy to defraud, and we'll be looking to interview you later on this morning.
Although he wasn't one of the ringleaders, a search of the property revealed that he was involved in more than just suspected insurance fraud.
A number of things were seized there, including the cultivation of cannabis, which the local police dealt with.
How many plants you got? 9, I'm further arresting you on suspicion of cultivation of cannabis.
I'm proper scared now.
It's all right.
I don't like dealing with people on the street because I smoke weed, like I've got my own bombs. I just sit in here and smoke weed.
The team then moved on to the final and most important location, a garage called Shell Shot, which was linked to all the suspects and all the cars.
When we delved deeper into the second claim in 2011, it became apparent that Shell Shot were clearly involved in some form of fraudulent activity.
The whole fraud centred around this main garage, Shell Shot, and all the vehicles either were from there or passed through there, but were borrowed and used in the contrived accidents and then done up and returned to their rightful owners or paid for by the insurance companies to be repaired.
Shell Shot was owned by Carter Oram, the owner of the Mazda, and Richard Cash. Both of these men were directly involved in the induced collision. And it was here that the IFED team hoped to apprehend their final suspect, Carter Oram.
Listen, Jared, hello, mate. I'm Mark Folsom from the City London Police, okay, Insurance Fraud Enforcement Department.
Right.
Okay. I need to speak to you about an allegation that's been made, okay, where the allegation is that you have conspired with others to defraud the insurance company, all right, namely the RBS, all right? So in relation to that, okay, I'm going to have to arrest you, okay? You don't have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention, when questioned, something which you later rely on in court. Okay. Anything you do say may be given evidence. And that's in relation, like I say, conspiracy to defraud, okay? We'll have to take you away now, okay? Is your boss here, or are you in charge, or whatever?
I'm in charge, yeah.
Their hunch that he'd be at work paid off, and he was taken away for further questioning.
Right, stick you in the cage, mate, and we'll take you back to Torquay. All right, jump in.
The team had made 3 arrests and recovered a wealth of evidence, but the complexity of the fraud meant that there were still people to track down.
The other suspects were arrested later on in Devon, and one suspect attended Bishopsgate Police Station voluntarily.
IFED's swift action ensured that the scam was shut down before the fraud could get any bigger. By April 2013, IFED had collected enough evidence to bring the main players to justice. Baker was sent down for 6 months, and Richard Cash for 14. Carter Oram received a 6-month jail term suspended for 12 months. Jennifer Shears, for her involvement in the first crash, was handed a 2-month prison sentence, suspended for 12 months.
Direct line groups has a zero tolerance to fraudulent insurance activity. I don't think they expected to get caught so quickly, but ultimately most fraudsters will get caught.
In 2012, Olympic fever was everywhere. For athletes who'd been chosen to represent their countries, this was the fulfillment of a long-held ambition. This was especially true for one young Afghani man living in West London. Against all the odds, Daz Siddiqui had made the Afghan boxing squad, and his inspirational story was starting to gain attention. In an article in The Sun, he was quoted as saying, "I know I won't be one of the favourites to win a medal, but being a competitor at the 2012 Olympics seemed just an impossible dream." He was right, but not in the way he intended. The whole thing was total fabrication. Siddiqui was actually a serial fraudster and fantasist. Tom Gardner from Aviva worked on the case.
It's not untypical of insurance fraudsters to have aliases. I guess what's surprising in this case is that he sought to bring such attention to himself.
In truth, Daz Siddiqui was a con man who lived in a fantasy world. He'd invented multiple personas to cheat money out of insurance companies, but his lies were uncovered by Aviva's fraud detection team, who spotted a number of suspicious claims.
We were able to identify matches between addresses and bank accounts, which originally alerted us to the fraud. And as we investigated that further, we were able to unravel the full scale of his fraud.
He'd set up a web of fake identities.
Majid Siddiqui went by a number of aliases, including Daz Siddiq, Owen Hart, and Kevin Heartbreak.
But Siddiqui's fraud went much further than just inventing fake names. DC John Hurley from the City of London's Police Insurance Fraud Enforcement Department also worked on the case.
He tried to cover his tracks to some extent by changing his name regularly by deed poll. In a 2-year period, he had anything up to 6 to 8 names. In fact, I imagine that he has got one name that he keeps to himself, but he's been known by so many different names that perhaps only he will ever know what his real name is.
But he didn't stop at fake identities. His financial arrangements revealed a web of lies too.
In total, we were able to identify 23 bank accounts. The bank accounts were used in the first place to obtain insurance under bogus names and addresses, and then also later to receive payments from claims.
Siddiqui was committing fraud on a massive scale.
So in total, we're aware of 46 claims which were presented for bogus injuries, which on a full liability basis would have had a value of about £500,000.
Siddiqui's fraudulent claims primarily involved car accidents that had never happened, with multiple occupants who never existed. He would then claim for car repair costs and personal injury compensation.
Mr. Siddiqui was not terribly sophisticated. He created a company that handled all these claims, but foolishly or otherwise, claimed that company was storing the vehicles, and he would also make personal injury claims and rent vehicles. And so to people who've worked in insurance fraud for a number of years, these things stick out.
Once they'd collected all the evidence they could, the insurers handed over their findings to IFED to take the investigation to the next stage.
There's some things they can't do and that police officers have to do, including tracing him through his bank accounts and through names and aliases that he'd given. Once we'd traced all these activities and put them together through mobile phone records and bank account details, it was just really a question of catching him in and making sure that he was caught red-handed, as the expression goes.
By now, there was enough evidence to move in and arrest him.
On the day of the raid, when we went in, he was watching the TV. And one of the things that was strangest to us is that amongst his various aliases and his various guises, he'd said that he was an Olympic boxer. And he was actually watching the Olympics when we came in, but it was the rowing. So we asked him about that. You know, aren't you supposed to be boxing for the country? And he said, oh yes, he'd injured himself. So he couldn't even be straight with us at that stage, even there standing in his pants.
The IFED team was able to collect a wealth of evidence.
Surrounding him were the tools of his trade. He had mobile phones with post-it notes on them in all the different names, so that if that phone went off, he'd instantly know who he was supposed to be.
With so many personas, it was hard for Siddiqui to keep track of who had put in what claim. The case proceeded to court, and Siddiqui was brought to justice.
He was charged with 11 counts of false representation under the Fraud Act, and also 1 count of holding a fake national ID card.
Perhaps realising that for once he should tell the truth, Siddiqui pleaded guilty.
He got 18 months, which, considering he'd spent 2 years actually doing the crimes, he had at least 18 months to regret it.
His elaborate fantasy existence had finally been brought to an end, and he had no one to blame but himself, whoever that was.
I do wonder at the end of it, who actually knows the real Daz Siddiqui?
Things you expect on a stag night. To get a bit drunk, and maybe round the evening off with a sing-song. One thing you don't expect is whiplash, but that's just what happened on Stephen Paul's stag do. The party had barely left Newcastle before festivities came to an abrupt halt, thanks to their minibus hitting a car. Aviva's Tom Gardner was yet again on the case and investigated the claim.
Mr. Paul took out a new policy with us to insure his minibus, and then contacted us several weeks later to report that he'd been in a collision with another vehicle.
Elaine Ibbotson worked for the insurer's solicitors.
It was suggested that there were a group of 14 men on their way to a stag party in Edinburgh. They were travelling in the minibus, and it was alleged that shortly after starting their journey, the minibus driver had left the main road north and had pulled off, I think, to visit a shop. Shortly after leaving the main road on the approach to a roundabout, it was alleged that the minibus collided with the rear of a car.
I believe 6 ambulances attended the scene. All of the people were treated at hospital.
The accident resulted in multiple injuries, primarily whiplash. It wasn't long before the insurers heard from the would-be partygoers on the minibus.
In total, 15 claims were presented for whiplash injuries, which on a full liability basis at the time would be potentially worth over £100,000.
Because it was such a huge sum of money, the team began to look more closely at the claim. And what they found called the whole Stag party story into question.
In the first place, just the number and severity of the injuries proportionate to the accident. In the second place, that the accident happened so soon after a new policy was taken out.
There's always an element of suspicion when every single occupant of both vehicles involved in a collision claims to have sustained almost identical injuries. It wasn't a huge impact one way you'd expect every single person to have been injured.
The lawyers decided to talk to all the main players and immediately encountered inconsistencies. The main claimant kept changing small details in his story.
His account really didn't ring true at all.
And there were also concerns from the police officers who had attended the accident.
Quite clearly they felt something wasn't right with the situation as they arrived at the scene.
The investigation continued and a vehicle assessor was sent to look at the damaged minibus.
One of the things that our engineers observed when they inspected the minibus was that some of the damage appeared quite old.
Serious questions were now being asked, not least why the men had set off for a meet-up with no spare clothes.
It also emerged that despite travelling to Edinburgh for a stag weekend, there was no luggage whatsoever in the minibus.
Piece by piece, the evidence was stacking up. Their story was falling apart. It seemed that the group had conspired to create a bogus accident so they could submit a massive insurance claim. The investigation was then widened to include those travelling in the car.
It became apparent that there were connections between the occupants of the two vehicles that were identified through social networking websites.
The confirmation that they knew each other was telling, but the final straw was a CCTV clip of the crash site, which showed that the accident had never occurred.
What we believe happened is that the two vehicles were damaged away from the scene, and then the accident was staged at some point and debris put onto the road to create the impression that an accident had occurred.
The Stag weekend in Edinburgh had been invented as a cover story for an audacious con trick, but it had all fallen apart like a late-night kebab. By now, there was enough evidence to take the culprits to court.
15 of the 16 people pleaded guilty and received suspended sentences. One person pleaded not guilty and he was tried by jury and later convicted.
The party was well and truly over for the Stag do, and the only cause for celebration was that time had been called on a massive insurance scam.